So you really breathtakingly took us through with a framework for getting from here to where we need to go. And I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, starting with Karen. I'm going to introduce all of you. So we have that out of the way, and then we're going to come back to Karen, and she will lead off. I'm going to sort of do a provocative question that will open things up for each one of the panelists, and then we're going to, you can comment on what you've heard, Arun, and then we're going to have, I hope, plenty of time from the audience for audience questions. And so if you have them, write them down, and I'm sure I'm going to wind up with a big pile here, which I'll do a bit of sorting and see what the most provocative we can find, and have questions and answers. So first of all, to introduce our distinguished panel, Karen Harbert is President and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Institute for 21st Century Energy. She testifies frequently before the Congress, and with her at the helm, the Chamber, my understanding is that Energy Institute is really playing a leading role in advocacy, analysis of energy issues, and in building a broad-based kind of a consensus that reaches out and tries to not just inform but move along with a policy framework and getting into action plans. Karen, before being with the Chamber, she was Assistant Secretary of Policy and International Affairs, also at the DOE, and Vice Chairman of the International Energy Agency located in Paris. That's a industrial country consortium that particularly focuses on coordination of energy supply when we have, if we have, disruptions and difficulties on the supply side. Karen has a bachelor's degree in political science from Rice University in Houston. Shark Yousafzai is vice president of Chevron Corporation, and there he supports Chevron CEO at the National Petroleum Council in their ongoing study of future fuels strategy and supply. And he also is serving as chair of the Supply and Infrastructure Task Group. And he also serves as Chevron's decision executive in downstream portfolio projects worldwide. And Shark is a fellow of the American Institute of Chemical Engineering, and he has received a bachelor's in chemical engineering from Texas A&M. And close to me, Ralph Cavanna, senior attorney for NRDC and co-director of NRDC's energy program. And he's been visiting professor at Stanford, UC Berkeley, Harvard, and a member of the National Commission on Energy Policy, which was funded by the Hewlett Foundation. And he has the pleasure of serving on the California Clean Energy Fund board with me. And my favorite, Ralph has received a number of awards, and my favorite is the Lifetime Achievement in Energy Efficiency, which he received from California's ongoing Flex Your Power campaign. And I happen to know what that's all about, and Ralph will maybe tell us about it. So Ralph received his degrees, undergraduate and law, from Yale University, which is rather close to my heart. So that is the panel. And Karen, we're going to start with you in terms of a question. And I've often participated in discussions of how do we define sustainable development, and my own fallback in terms of how I define sustainable development is said, I confess I have a real problem coming to closure. The one thing I do know is that in order to get down the road and to achieving sustainable development, lots of people are going to make lots of money getting us there, because the governments cannot do it. It's got to be the private sectors around the world that are going to, within a framework of government policy, really be able to put the rubber on the road and get us down. So with that in mind, how do you see the American business community in relation to the framework that Arun put up on the board for us?
Sure.
Please.
Well, Mason, you raise a great point. I think the private sector is our first, second, and third line of offense and defense in some respects to address our energy and environmental challenges. I think the question is not what is the role of the private sector in that investment. I think the question has increasingly become is where is that investment going to occur, and when, and under what conditions. When you look worldwide, we know the demand for energy is going to go up by almost 50% between now and 2035. What has changed is where that demand is going, to the slide that you put up in the beginning. It's increasingly in the developing world. Almost 90% of that demand growth is not going to be in the OECD countries. It's going to be in China and India and the Middle East. So you're seeing producers of energy reorient their supply chains to the new demand, the next customer. And that means that for us in the United States, that we have to become increasingly self-sufficient. Not independent, but self-sufficient. And when you look at meeting that 49% growth in energy demand, it's going to take a lot of money. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, estimates that's going to take about $26 trillion. And I think the question for us is any of that money going to be coming here? Or do we have the right regulatory, fiscal, legal framework here to encourage that investment to come here, to develop resources and technologies in the United States? I'll challenge sort of the title of this panel, which is, we say we want secure and affordable, reliable, sustainable energy. Really, do we? Do we have the framework in place to actually encourage that investment here? We have a funny way of showing it, and I just want to go through a couple of the areas and what our policies are, and maybe we need to challenge the policy framework. We are still, like it or not, for our transportation sector, very dependent on oil. And yet we're importing 60% of our oil, and we have a ton of reserves here in the United States, but we don't want to develop them. In the Gulf of Mexico, people are not yet back to work in the Gulf of Mexico. We can't develop offshore in the Atlantic. We have a moratorium on the Pacific coast. Increasingly, we're closing things down in Alaska and revoking leases, onshore in our Midwest. So do we really want to not import oil from abroad? If we really wanted to do that, we would be developing more here. In the coal area, in the electricity area, let's think about that for a minute. We are still 50% dependent for our electricity on coal. In the wake of the big floods in Australia, when they were unable to export coal in Australia, our coal industry stepped up and exported a ton of coal to China. And all of a sudden they're realizing they've got a great customer in China. So now the coal industry has reoriented itself to start exporting in great quantities. We've got about 250 years worth of coal in this country. Nobody's building a coal-fired power plant in this country. Why would you, when you really don't know what the environmental framework is going to be? But at the same time, we're not investing in the technologies at scale to be able to prove out the sequestration of carbon, to be able to use our coal in this country cleanly over time. But other countries are going to use that coal. China's going to use it. India's going to use it. So wouldn't we rather use it in a clean way here and have the technology we can develop here and export globally? We're not doing it at scale. Nuclear. I'm sure we'll get into this later in the Q&A because that's on everybody's mind. We haven't built a new nuclear plant in this country in over 30 years. It provides 20% of our electricity. We have developed very high quality new types of nuclear power plants, yet it takes at least 8 to 10 years to get through the regulatory process. It takes 3 years in China, 5 years in France. Do we want nuclear power in this country? That's going to be a big debate after Japan, but we certainly have a funny way of showing that we want emissions-free nuclear power in this country, and we certainly don't want to deal with the waste issue. You know, if Yucca Mountain is off the table, what are we going to do with our nuclear waste? We're not prepared to make these hard decisions. You know, in the renewable area, we certainly have a funny way of showing love to the renewable industry too. We turn the production tax credit or investment tax credit on and off every 1 or 2 years. You know, that really impedes capital formation. And it's hard to make a business model on not knowing whether that's going to be there or not. And we don't want to build the transmission lines from where the renewable energy is to where the markets are. Crossing in people's backyards, it's very, very unpopular. And of course, you know, you brought up the battery issue, Arun. If we're going to be increasingly moving to different types of storage and lithium-ion batteries, we don't produce any of those rare earth elements here in this country anymore. China does. Should we be thinking about that a little more strategically about where we're going to get these elements? Yes, we should, but we have a policy not to develop those resources here in this country. So I sort of challenge, you know, the premise is we say we want it. Are we doing anything about it? In the area of R&D, which you oversee, Arun, you know, absent the stimulus package, we're investing less in energy research and development than we were after the Arab oil embargo. So do we really want it? Are we really having the framework in place to actually use our resources here at home, develop the resources of tomorrow? No. And that's why capital is going elsewhere. People are sitting on their capital here in the United States because we have policies and regulations in place that are impeding our energy security, impeding the investment, the jobs that would come here if we actually were to allow that investment and the private sector to do what it does best, which is to invest, to innovate, and to build. And right now, we're not building anything in this country, and we're certainly importing more and more energy from abroad. And I think that should worry all of us as we look to transitioning to a cleaner and more secure future. What are we doing to take care of today's needs? And the answer is really little.
Okay, that's
Isn't that uplifting? Nobody needs any coffee now. I've got everybody waiting.
We got to get a little uplift here before we close this out, and it's going to come from.
Well, that's why you have Shark. He's going to tell you how to fix it all.
So, Shark, Yosef-Sai, Chevron's predecessor, Standard Oil Company of California, obtained the original concession from the Saudi family to explore for oil in Saudi Arabia. And in light of the Arabian Spring that seems to be threatening the kingdom in the heartland of world oil, what about, on the one hand, the thoughts that keep coming back about what's called peak oil, and then what are the prospects for the multinational oil industry giants like Chevron of being a very prominent one, what are the prospects for diversifying away from oil to development of alternative energy sources?
Well, thanks for that question, Mason, and really kudos to the two presenters. Dr. Majumdar really posed some very, very interesting questions about the development of technology. And certainly the work at ARPA-E has just been outstanding. But I was really reflecting, Arun, on something that you said, which I think is very, very important to set the answer to the multiple questions that you asked and to set the context, and that is the supply-demand balance. So if you look at the world today and the world to 2050, there are a few statistics that I think are quite sobering. First of all, the population of the world is expected to be 9 billion by 2050. We currently consume 255 million barrels of oil equivalent, which translates to 125,000 gallons per second per day. And if you looked at the slides that Dr. Majumdar presented, we in the United States consume a disproportionate amount relative to our size, relative to our population. And certainly as the burgeoning demand in India and China and the developing world grows, and of those 9 billion people, 1 billion people live on $1 a day. And as they increase their national aspirations, and as they increase their economic development, a few hard truths really need to be confronted. First of all, with this huge amount of population growth, burgeoning demand, economic development, we're going to use all and need all kinds of energy, all forms of energy. Conventional energy, oil and gas, and coal will not be able to meet the demand of the world to 2050. But it is a statistic that we need to be very, very mindful of, that for the next 35 to 50 years, oil, gas, and coal will continue to represent somewhere between 80 to 85% of the energy pie. It'll be a much larger energy pie. And the issue that Arun talked about, the issue of making sure that we have economic growth and clean, safe, reliable energy, affordable energy to the populations of the world is extremely important. And so the diversity of supply is something that we really need to be mindful of. And there are 4 things that I think in the context of the question, there are multiple questions that you asked, that we really need to understand. First, we must continue to invest and gain access to oil and gas. And what that means is that the industry needs to continue to have a climate of investment. And some of the numbers that I'm going to share with you in a second are quite staggering. The international oil companies and energy companies are investing $500 billion this year. Chevron itself is investing $26 billion in producing oil and gas and renewable energy. On the question of energy, I think energy saved is energy earned. So the question of energy conservation and energy efficiency is one that is hugely important. And thirdly, Arun also talked about we must create sustainable sources of energy, energy that doesn't need to be subsidized. Chevron, for example, is the largest producer of renewable fuels in the world with our geothermal projects in Indonesia and the Philippines that do not require subsidies, that are at scale, and currently produce as much electricity as all of the photovoltaics in the world. In fact, twice the amount of solar energy that is produced in the United States. Our Chevron Technology Ventures is looking at things such as cellulosic ethanol and biofuels. But what Arun talked about is that we must balance aspirations with reality. A couple more statistics. There is something called the Renewable Fuel Standard that all of us have to meet by 2022. And that is 36 billion gallons of renewable fuels, of which 21 billion gallons have to be advanced fuels. That translates to a forest the size of New Mexico and an algae pond the size of Lake Erie. So the technology challenge is huge. But with the work that ARPA-E is doing and with partnerships that we can all form with industry, with NGOs, with academia, I am sure that this triangulation of the question, energy security, economic prosperity, and environmental, can be solved. But it will take all of us working in partnership, policy, regulation, technology, innovation, and partnership to help meet that challenge.
Excellent. Ralph, I'm going to be a little controversial in terms of how I'm going to try to step through this with some care, but despite the rather profound differences in American opinion, it does seem to me that in all the controversy surrounding the science, that the consensus of scientific opinion endures that the combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, is a major cause, not the only cause, a major cause of global climate change. And this 80%, 85% reliance on fossil energy going forward, and the momentum behind all of that. In the face of that, from your perspective, how do we carve a pathway towards a sustainable natural environment that is going to be able to provide a really a healthy environment for the planet as a whole, given that climate change is out there and going to be happening?
Can we, for example, stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere while still doing all the things that my colleagues have described? Right. I didn't know what Mason's provocative question would be at the outset, but I knew going into it that I would have to face one source of skepticism from the audience, namely Department of Energy, Chamber of Commerce, Chevron. Obviously, these must be people I plan to spend my entire professional career suing. And I want to encourage you all not to dwell on that, because I think I can find a few things in 5 minutes that they can agree on, and maybe I can succeed in cheering them up just a bit along with all of you. In doing that, I want to say at the outset that I think that the most important energy resource needed to respond to Mason's challenge isn't going to be coal or nuclear or natural gas or solar or wind. It's going to be a resource that is best known and has had perhaps its most complete development here in California. But it's a resource that I can best describe by looking backward rather than looking. Aaron rightly looked forward, and many of my other colleagues have been doing that too. But I want to look backward for just a second and remind you all that since the early 1970s, the U.S. economy has more than tripled in size, and its total energy consumption has increased by less than a third. That means that something rather dramatic was happening to energy intensity, to the amount of energy required to provide $1 of economic value. And in fact, that was dropping by more than 50%. And the energy efficiency resource that made that growth possible was larger than all of the additions of natural gas and oil and coal combined in the U.S. economy. And for that reason, I want to emphasize my hope that we'll all pay a lot of attention to that resource. Chevron and NRDC are both supporters, along with Mason's and my beloved California Clean Energy Fund, of the University of California Davis's Center on Energy Efficiency, which unveiled in the last year an international unit of measure for the energy efficiency resource, which Arun well knows is called the Rosenfeld, named after a wonderful Bay Area scientist who's widely regarded as the father and grandfather of energy efficiency, Art Rosenfeld. The Rosenfeld is an amount of energy equivalent to the annual output of one giant coal-fired power plant. Every year, California's electric utilities, through their investments in energy efficiency alone, generate the equivalent of one Rosenfeld. The U.S. economy has produced the equivalent of thousands of Rosenfelds over the past 35 years. And a central challenge for all of us is how to accelerate that pace, because all those citizens of the world, those 9 billion people we are anticipating, their demand isn't for energy. It's for energy services. It's for the heating, lighting, mechanical drive, motion that energy can provide. And a fundamental and decisive question in terms of what it will take to provide those services to the world is the level of energy efficiency we can generate across our economy and international and global economies. And I hope that a collective challenge of all of us going forward will be to do as much as we can to exploit the energy efficiency resource as the fastest, cheapest, and cleanest way forward, because we can't afford an all-of-the-above solution to energy production and use in the United States and in the world. We're going to have to find the best buys first. We're going to need a system that lets winners and losers emerge on the merits. We're going to need business models for our electric utilities that allow them to be at least as profitable when they promote efficiency as when they develop additional sources of conventional supply. And if you want an illustration of a place that's done that, you need to look no further than California. I want to close, and I know we'll get into some more controversial subjects in the question and answer, on a common theme, though. I take it as an action item going out of this room, and I take it from what my colleagues have just said, that the Chamber of Commerce, Chevron, and NRDC are now off to Washington with a unified agenda to get the ARPA-E R&D funding at full levels through the Congress this year, and I look forward to doing that. Thank you. And Aaron, that's a winning combination most of the time.
That's a spontaneous applause for you, Arun, and get you down the road. And before we open it up to some questions I have here, how about you coming back in and weighing in with your thoughts, so what you heard from the panel
Well,
here?
first of all, I would say I won't argue with that. But thank you for the support. I appreciate the endorsement of all of you.
Those two are much more valuable than mine right now.
But let me pick up on what you just said. I think, first of all, we should recognize that Ralph is the innovator in a policy which California adopted in 1978, if I remember,
Sure.
if I understand it right, called the decoupling policy, which has made energy efficiency to be actually a money-making, a profitable thing, and reduce the electricity consumption, utility consumption of electricity. So this is something that was an innovation in policy in the 1970s, and I just want to applaud Ralph, and we should all thank him. And I think we need to have those innovations in policy again in this now new interest in energy. But there's something I would just like to point out, that there's a plot that I did not show out here, called, on the vertical axis is Human Development Index, which is often the quality of life. And the x-axis is the per capita electricity use, which is often a sign of prosperity. And one would expect that as you want to have better quality of life, the electricity use increases, which is true initially, but then it sort of saturates. And then there's an asymptote out there. And there's a lot of countries, a lot of regions in the world where the electricity use is way high and the quality of life really does not increase. And US is somewhere, not quite of the way extreme, but somewhere in between. So the question I have for you is that how do you get energy efficiency, which I think we all agree is the lowest hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. Often people say it's fruit hard to pick. Some people say it's on the ground, it's rotting. So how do you make energy efficiency profitable, number one? How do you reduce the electricity or energy use per capita without changing the quality of life, but while actually improving the quality of life on an individual basis? And I think in the industrial sector, we're seeing a lot of companies are trying to get more energy efficient because it saves them dollars. This is purely financial. But on an individual basis, how would one do that, Ralph?
Yeah, I should note, by the way, my very favorite part of Chevron is called Chevron Energy Services, as you know well, which is in business to do precisely that, to help people get a lot more work out of a lot less energy. Chevron Energy Services is profitable when it does that. An enduring problem with not just the US, but the worldwide utility sector is that we've set up a system of utility regulation and pricing in the US and worldwide that, for the most part, quite unintentionally, makes the utility sector dependent on increased electricity and natural gas use for its own financial health. It is easy to solve that problem, to break the link between financial health and sales. It is also straightforward to provide performance-based rewards for utilities that help their customers use energy more efficiently. And I hope coming out of this room also that a common agenda can be trying to expand that model. It is somewhat disconcerting that California had it by the late 1970s, but that today, for example, less than a quarter of the United States has it in terms of the way the electric utility sector is organized, and only a few places elsewhere in the world has it even popped up yet. So that is a problem that remains to be solved, but optimism about solving it. You gave, through your own presentation, extraordinary examples of the prospects for getting dramatically more work out of less energy. But you don't have to look forward again, you can look back. When any of you goes out and buys a refrigerator next year, it'll use 1/4 as much electricity as the average model of the 70s. It will be a vastly better device. None of you would trade the new one for the old one. It was a combination of incentives and efficiency standards at the government level that delivered it. And another common agenda, I hope, can be to continue that virtuous pattern of incentives and standards going forward to accelerate progress in the United States and internationally.
Mason, if I could just add a couple
Sure.
of things to what has been said. You know, there are obviously two major parameters driving energy consumption, industrial or commercial, and then transportation. Vehicle miles travel are probably the most important parameter in determining how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions while conserving energy. Secretary Coonan, whom you know very well, has done a model that shows that if we increase CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards, to 54 miles a gallon, which is really doable, and with about $1,000 to $2,000 invested in new materials, efficiency of tires, and other things of that nature, we could actually reduce energy consumption by 20%. And that 20% number is also the amount that we, in our refining system, which is a very energy-intensive system at Chevron, have reduced our energy consumption while keeping our capacity the same. So I absolutely agree that a clean energy future is also an energy-efficient future. They are very, very related.
Okay, I'm going to shift over here now to a question. I think this is going to come back for you to be teed up again, if it's all right, Shark. This relates to natural gas. And in the context of what my friend Dan Yergin calls the shale gale, how do you see, and this is a domestic source of fossil energy. Natural gas, as we know, is about a third in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of, say, coal, and without carbon capture and sequestration. But how do you see the role of our natural gas resource? And some people would say, well, hey, this is a bridge to the future. Other people might say, well, gee, you got a little problems with water and other things environmentally in terms of development. So is it a bridge to the future, or is it a bridge too far?
Now, I don't think it's a bridge too far. Let me just address the question in two contexts. One, a global context with Australia and its huge natural gas resources and what we're doing there. And then the second question is within the United States. There was a study done called The Hard Truths About Energy. And Dave O'Reilly, who was our former chairman and CEO, was a member of the executive committee, and he said in the last 5 years, the one thing that that study missed was the huge resource of shale gas or tight gas in the United States. A subsequent study that has been commissioned by the National Petroleum Council and Secretary Chu has really unearthed the fact that natural gas, shale gas, and tight gas is a huge energy resource for the U.S. It has to be produced safely, it has to be produced reliably, but in fact, natural gas and the replacement of coal with natural gas is a huge factor in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 in the United States. The question that has recently been asked, that of hydrofracking and horizontal drilling, is it safe? We've seen some stories on 60 Minutes. As a matter of fact, hydrofracking or hydraulic fracturing has been around for 60 years. In 2004, the Environmental Protection Agency certified it as a safe practice. This year, the Congress has asked for a transparent review of the environmental practices, including reuse of water, and we welcome that. Chevron, as you know, recently made an acquisition of Atlas Gas, which has huge resources in the Marcellus Shale, and that shale is 5,000 feet below, the shale gas, below the water table. There are redundant systems built into it, and in fact, the way you measure the environmental impact of materials that are injected is something called the Material Safety Data Sheet, MSDS sheets. The number of MSDS sheets that used to exist 20 years ago was 30. It's down to 7. So it is a huge resource. It can be used to generate electricity. It can be used in CNG, LNG vehicles. It can be used to convert to liquids and make diesel. In fact, it can be used to generate hydrogen, which is also something that is a debate that is going on between the government on the one hand and OEMs. Our friends at Toyota and General Motors and Mercedes will tell you that in their view, hydrogen vehicles will be commercial by 2015 and 2016. So natural gas can be used for that also. And it is a domestic resource. So my view is that is something that we need to develop to promote energy security and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we can do it economically.
You know, it
Karen,
really is it's a life raft that has been given to us here in the United States. You know, 5-7 years ago, we were building terminals to import natural gas from places around the world. Those terminals are now being looked at as potentially export terminals, because we have no idea, just a scant 5-7 years ago, that we were really the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. And what's sort of unfortunate about, you know, we have a blessing here, and of course, you know, people rapidly try and turn it into a curse. We have 60 Minutes, and we have movies out there called Gasland that are propagating myths about natural gas. And the process of hydraulic fracking, and has been used safely for 60 years, all of a sudden, the Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has commissioned a study that's going to take several years to go back and review all of the data that the EPA has already certified. So I hope we don't turn this blessing, which will allow us to become increasingly more self-reliant, into a curse, because then we will use that resource. It just won't be here in the United States. We will export it somewhere else. And that certainly doesn't put us on a path for more economic and energy security. So, you know, we need to be thoughtful as we examine some of these issues, and not take options off the table when we actually have real domestic options here on
Ralph,
the
you
table.
want to
I
chime
think
in here?
this is an important colloquy right now, because this is a dramatic new development. First of all, let me acknowledge this. On Monday, my name will be on a report that will come out from a group called the Bipartisan Policy Center, which will take a look at the implications of the new findings on the U.S. domestic natural gas resources in terms of both our economic and our environmental future. I want to be clear that I agree that expectations are rightly, fundamentally changing about the availability of natural gas in the United States. I also think that it is going to be critical going forward, if that resource is going to do what I hope it will do, which is to greatly reduce the cost of decarbonizing the U.S. economy, which is to make efficient applications of natural gas possible across a much broader array of end uses, as just suggested by my Chevron colleague. It will be critical that high standards of environmental performance are maintained by the industry. The difference between now and 60 years ago is we're doing a lot of this. There are tens of thousands of these operations going on across the United States, not of uniformly high quality. It is critical that the Chamber, that Chevron, who I share with them aspirations for what this can mean in terms of a good news story for the U.S. energy economy, but the bad actors need to be pushed out. There need to be rigorous standards of performance for both water and air quality, for example. We got to make sure the well casings don't fracture, particularly at the level of water supply. And I think the right way to take the public concerns about environmental performance is to respond, as some in the industry have done, as I believe Chevron has done, by saying we'll meet those standards, bring them on. And in the process, we will create a new good news story for the U.S. energy economy, and we could all use one right now.
So I'll bring up as far as a little desire for good news from somewhere, that I'll mention the N word and nuclear power, and we've had a number of questions about nuclear power from the audience. And so is it really time for a renaissance in nuclear power within the U.S.? And should a real note of caution be there within the U.S. in the sense that if you analyze the highest risk coming out of Japan, it's out of the spent fuel pools at the reactors in the power stations that were affected by the earthquake tsunami. And in the United States, the spent fuel is piling up at power reactors. We do not have any kind of a longer-term solution for that. The government has been under legal obligation to take it off the hands of the utilities that have nuclear power stations, but it's been unable to fulfill that obligation. So how does and when do we really address squarely the back end of the fuel cycle within the United States, which I think is maybe the Achilles heel if we're going to have a renaissance? Who would like to go for that?
I'll certainly just comment on a few things. You know, we certainly are going to learn a lot from what is transpiring in Japan, and we should. And we should examine our existing fleet and certainly, you know, any capacity additions to ensure that they meet the highest safety and have the appropriate oversight. If you look at the proposed new plants that are going to be using, in this case, Westinghouse, the AP1000 technology, the first one that's really on the board is a plant that is going to be built, maybe, in Georgia by the Southern Company. It is 130 miles inland. 220 feet above sea level. And if the outcome of this is that we then expect that plant to be able to withstand a tsunami, that seems a little far-fetched, that it would be exposed to that type of vulnerability. And it would, in order to withstand that it would have to put in all kinds of things that aren't relevant to that plant. It would make it too costly, and it won't get built. So as we look forward and look at some new plant capacity additions, we have to have the appropriate safety regulations put in place. The good news about the new fleet of nuclear plants is that they have what they call passive safety systems. I've told the industry you got to find a new name because that sounds terrible. Passive, it sounds like you're doing nothing. But what it means is that it can operate without electricity and without human operation. So if that type of operation had been in place in Japan, we would be in a far different situation than we are today. But fundamentally, we have to get serious about the back end and addressing the waste problem. Nobody in the world has addressed it. France hasn't addressed it. Japan hasn't addressed it. Europe. And we are seeing a huge growth of nuclear power in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. And so here's an opportunity for U.S. leadership, true U.S. leadership, which is if we can solve it here, we will be able to find a path forward for other countries to be able to solve it. And we could actually be the leader in that regard. And the President has appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission to look at nuclear waste. They should be looking at all of the options, in our view, including Yucca Mountain, on whether that is the most over-researched, over-invested piece of real estate in the United States at the moment. We've looked at that and spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to see if we can store nuclear waste there. But we have to be serious about it. And we also have to be serious about examining reprocessing so we have less waste and recycling, you know, the inputs into our reactors. So, you know, there is going to be an expansion of nuclear power, and we need to make sure that it is done in such a way that we can deal with the waste issue and that we have site-appropriate safety regulations.
Mason, I suspect you wanted me to...
I want to come back to Arun at the end.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Just to say a word about this. First of all, in terms of what to do with the waste over the long haul, it's not fundamentally an economic or an environmental problem. It's a political problem. Believe it or not, no state in the United States yearns for the honor of hosting the nation's long-term waste disposal. And indeed, in the mid-1980s, the Congress of the United States solved this problem by uniting together around the solution of Nevada, widely supported by everyone but Nevada. And it turns out that that consensus wasn't strong enough. I think the immediate lesson, therefore, is that prospects aren't terrific for getting another state to volunteer. But the one thing we can do is get as much of the waste as possible out of the pools and into the secure casks that increasingly are proliferating around the country at nuclear power plant sites, which are a short-term expedient on the order of decades, but clearly a better solution than having them underwater in light of what we've just seen. And by the way, if you were expecting an I told you so message from me, I have not been talking about operational safety issues on nuclear for the last 30 years because I think the U.S. industry has a strong record there. I've been talking about the availability of better investments. The reason I don't expect a nuclear renaissance today Mason any more than I expected one a month ago, is that I think America's utilities have better investments to make. And that as long as we stay with the competitive procurement model, which is the way we do it in the United States, China, Russia, France, they let the central government pick the generation sources. We use competitive procurement by the private sector. I don't think the Chamber of Commerce is going to yell at me about that. And I think we may be together on the proposition. We think that's the way it should go going forward. And then for me, it's another good news story. The reason I don't expect a nuclear renaissance is I think a whole host of better investments, starting with energy efficiency, are going to sweep the table.
Arun, do you want to
Sure.
come in on this?
I think Karen is absolutely right. I think right now, it's we're trying to understand what happened in Japan. There's a lot of data that is missing, and I think we should learn from what actually happened, as opposed to what we are only seeing on television, and take a pause really to see whether our current fleet of nuclear reactors are safe. And if we find that they're safe, and I just want to echo what Ralph said, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission, our safety is probably the best in the world, and probably the most stringent. And we should take pause and then see whether we are safe and how to plan forward and move forward. But if I'm wearing my administration hat, which I am all the time in public, we are committed to nuclear. I think it absolutely makes sense. But we should take pause and see whether we are safe or not. On the waste issue, as you pointed out, there is a Blue Ribbon Commission, and I think I agree with you. We should look at all the options, and there are ways of doing it safely. We're doing it in New Mexico, and use that opportunity, then look at the waste problem. But I think the administration, the president, and the secretary is very much committed to nuclear. In fact, this is the first nuclear plants that we are now providing loan guarantees. The loan guarantees has been used now to invest, to provide the financing for the nuclear plants, first time in 30 years. And this is happening as we speak. And so this is, so the administration is committed.
So the WIP project in New Mexico is open. In the Yucca Mountain, my understanding was that that was off the table in terms of what the commission was looking at. And is that still off the table after the election?
Well, I think it's premature to say that. The Blue Ribbon Commission is working right now.
Yeah.
The report should come out, this year, and we'll see. And at this point,
and it's okay if they look at sites?
I'll wait for the commission to report.
Understood. Okay, let's have a question on biofuels, and I think Sharkey, you'd have a point of view on this. As far as biofuels in the transportation field, but there are a whole ranging from cellulosic over to algae, and some companies that are in the Bay Area working hard on algae kinds of things. And then Arun, maybe you'd have a comment as well, but let's start with you.
Well, I'd
Shark.
like to put it in the context of the study that I'm on the future of transportation fuels. And our biofuels work stream is being headed up by a gentleman by the name of Todd Werpy, who is Chief Technology Officer of ADM. And basically, a few things are coming to the fore. One, corn-based ethanol, whether you look at it from an energy resource standpoint or the struggle between food and fuel, is very problematic. However, second generation advanced biofuels, whether it's from algae or biomass, we are working on it as well as others, but the technological hurdles are huge. I already talked about the size of the forest that would be needed to produce the biomass being the size of New Mexico and the algae pond being the size of Lake Erie. I think technology will get there, but getting to the renewable fuel standards of 36 billion gallons for the United States is hugely problematic. But I think, if you look at Brazil and the fact that they can actually transport sugarcane-based ethanol through pipelines, that is something that we need to learn from. I think we will need biofuels. I think they're part of the overall energy mix. but I think it would be rather Pollyannish to think that there would be a barrel-for-barrel replacement.
Shouldn't we end subsidies for corn-based ethanol?
In my view, yes.
More, we'll be out there together.
And should we enable imports of biofuels from Brazil?
I'm always for free
Yes.
trade, absolutely.
And Cuba?
He said, and Cuba.
And Cuba.
Cuba.
Well, I just thought I'd go.
As far as I know, the chemical composition is the same.
But there's an interesting point that needs to be brought up, is in this renewable fuel standard, every year they set how much should come from which type of fuel source. And for the last 2 years, they've had to waive those requirements because the cellulosic ethanol is not yet available at commercially viable scale.
He needs more resources.
And everybody is in favor of Arun having more resources, but that's not going to tomorrow get the cellulosic ethanol to the scale that we need it. So we have a policy in place that every year we actually void because we can't meet it. And so there's got to be a recognition of the pace of technology in future policies when we put them in place, that we actually recognize technology readiness and invest in accelerating that readiness rather than just mandating something and expecting it to happen. That doesn't normally work very well.
So I, as chair of this exercise, I've been focused on my colleagues here in terms of the discussion. It's been very lively, and I saw a stop come up. So I think we are almost out of time. One last question. Can we bear for that? In relation to a country like China, it revolves around the fact that China had a huge issue in relation to bringing solar and wind power into their overall supply mix and the grid. And it succeeded in reforming their whole grid structure. And what went in was a congeries of pieces of this and that and the other thing. What came out were two burly national grid companies that had the scope and the reach to get this remote supply into the sources of demand. It took them 18 months to get all that done. And the question is, does the U.S. ever look abroad and see other ways of doing things and getting us down the road with an accelerator that we borrow from some other country in terms of aiming toward more sustainable energy futures?
All right. Well,
We'll give you the last word, Arun.
well, I think the system that they have in China, the state grid, for example, can afford to do a few things. They have high voltage transmission, DC transmission, AC transmission, absolutely critical to be able to generate power, in the eastern, sort of the western part of China, and get it to Shanghai and other things, which is absolutely critical. In the United States, we have a statewide, regulatory commissions, PUCs, utility commissions, and I think it is really important to be able, and we just chatted about this, to be able to make sure that the state-wise things is actually coordinated in a way that all the incentives are aligned, and thereby be able to do things across state lines that otherwise may not be possible. I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, there's a
He has left
transmission
us with a huge challenge here in California of what we've got as far as energy policy in America is this fabulous structure that our founding fathers bequeathed upon us, which is 50 state laboratories. Now, if we can work, as you have said, and be able to synchronize the policies in a way that we get national scale out of the 50 state laboratories, I think that's a good up note to end this panel discussion. And thank you all, and thank you